bright scientists into Monsanto's laboratories, into laboratories in different colleges where it's basically pro-GM, and then sending them back with the mission to spread the gospel about GMOs. So and they're also giving a ton of money to Africa, and certainly Africans need money. The Gates Foundation and others, the Danforth Foundation, they're giving tons of money with the State Department's,
approval,
facilitation and approval into Africa, and it's a very dangerous situation because they're right now in the crosshairs of the biotech industry.
Let's wrap up the hour talking about the sugar beet then. Where is this GM food going to be put?
Well, 90 or 95% of the sugar beets are genetically modified. Now, a federal court just determined that the approval of the sugar beets, like the alfalfa before it, was illegal. That the Agriculture Department did not do a proper evaluation of the environmental impacts, but because after Monsanto introduced it, they threw out all of the non-GM seeds, they said, well, there's no seeds. If you try and do an injunction and prevent the planting of GM seeds, then you'll destroy the industry. So the judge said, okay, we won't have a temporary injunction, but in July we're going to revisit that, and I might do a permanent injunction. However, because the Supreme Court will be ruling in June about alfalfa, if they rule in Monsanto's favor, then it's possible that the federal court will not do a permanent injunction and will continue to be eating the genetically modified sugar until we fight it in other ways.
This could be one of the biggest stories of the millennium, Jeffrey.
It already is. I mean, right now, George, they're feeding the products of an infant science to the entire population. They're putting it into the environment where it can never be fully recalled with current technology. Now, there's never been a technology deployed this way. I mean, some people think, well, what about asbestos and what about tobacco? This is permanent gene pollution and full-on exposure to the entire population. And when we look at, another study, they find that they fed female rats genetically modified soy.
Let's talk about that when we come back. That study, and then we'll get into what the FDA is doing to protect us. If anything, we'll be back.
Never miss a detail on a show or a guest. Get the new Coast Zone newsletter.
Jeffrey, you were talking about some kind of research or study before the break.
Yes, we had talked at the top of the hour about hamsters losing the ability to get pregnant or have children after 3 generations of being fed genetically modified soy. And there was also 20 or 25% death rate among the newborns compared to only a 5% in the control. Now, that immediately harkens back to another study in Russia also with rats. The mother rats were fed genetically modified soy starting 2 weeks before they conceived. And more than half of the babies died within 3 weeks. There was that compared to only a 10% death rate. So again, about a 5-fold increase in infant mortality. The offspring also were smaller on average, and when they tried to reproduce, the group that was trying to reproduce among the GM-fed group was not able to. Now, it's interesting that this is not isolated either. We have other incidences. We have the Austrian study where they fed corn to mice, and the mice had smaller litters and smaller babies. We had the buffalo that had reproductive problems, including infertility, when they were eating genetically modified cottonseed. We have male rats that were fed genetically modified soybeans, and the testicles actually changed color from pink to blue. We have mice that were fed genetically modified soy, and their testicles changed, including damage to the young sperm cells and changes in the way the DNA functioned among the offspring when parents were fed, at least the embryo offspring, when the parents were fed genetically modified soy. So we're seeing a pattern here of reproductive problems. Now, what was the response by the scientific community when this astounding result in the Russian National Academy of Sciences in 2005, about over 50% death rate? Instead of repeating the study, they attacked and vilified Dr. Irina Ermakova, the Russian scientist, and she had documents burnt on her desk, samples that were stolen. Her boss, from pressure from his boss, told her she couldn't do any more GMO research. What's an interesting thing happened, however, is that when she had conducted 3 studies in a row with similar results and this very high death rate, Coincidentally, the rat chow that was being fed to all the rats in her facility switched so that it was based now on genetically modified soy. So she couldn't do any more studies. So what did she do? After 2 months, she asked her colleagues, what's the mortality rate in your studies? Completely unrelated to GMOs, but now all of the rats in this facility were eating genetically modified soy. The mortality rate had jumped to over 55%.
That's huge.
So one of the colleagues tried to comfort Dr. Ermakova when she couldn't do any more research by having the audacity to say, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. Now, if you look at the
like genocide.
Yes, I mean it's crazy. If you look, and we're also finding that the overuse of the Roundup may be causing reproductive problems as well. I'm just reading that and talking to scientists now to explore that. So when we look at the statistics of health in the United States, we see a high incidence of low birth weight babies starting in the mid-90s when GM soy was introduced. We see a high infant mortality, not just from soy, not just from GM introduction, but also it's been high for several years since it was introduced. We see all sorts of infertility on the rise as well, and no one is looking to see if it's the genetically modified soy or corn that has been shown in these studies to have a big problem.
Why aren't they looking at that, Jeffrey?
Well, this is the problem is if you show any incidence of disease higher with GMOs compared to non-GM, you blow the myth that GMOs are the same. And this myth was created by the FDA, actually by the biotech industry through their enforcement wing, the FDA. You see, in 1991, the first Bush administration told the FDA to promote the biotechnology industry. They were mistaken to believe that it would increase U.S. exports and shore up a U.S. trade deficit. Well, the opposite happened, and we spent $3 to $5 billion in extra money each year propping up the GM crops no one wants, and our exports reduced, but that's another story. So the FDA responded to this order by the White House by creating a new position for Michael Taylor, specifically for Michael Taylor. Now, why Michael Taylor? Taylor was Monsanto's former attorney. He was also the attorney for a Biotech Information Council, a group of biotech companies, and for his clients, he had designed a regulatory framework that they could lobby for, which would allow GMOs to be fast-tracked. So the position that they created for him was the Deputy Commissioner of Policy, the number 2 man at the agency, and the person overlooking the policy when GMO policy was created. Now, when the policy came out, there was a sentence that claimed basically that GMOs were no different, and on that basis, no testing was necessary, no labeling was necessary. The FDA would not even have to approve GMOs or even know if a GMO was being introduced to the market. Now, this was all based on this false concept that they knew of no information showing that GMOs were significantly different. We didn't know it was a false concept until a colleague of mine, Steve Drucker, sued the FDA. 44,000 formerly secret FDA documents were made public, and what it revealed was that the overwhelming consensus among the FDA's own scientists, starting in 1991 when they were looking at GMOs, was that it was dangerous. Not only different, but dangerous. That it could create allergies and toxins and new diseases and nutritional problems. They spelled it out. Different divisions had their own descriptions. One said new toxins, higher levels of existing toxins, accumulations of toxins from the environment, bioaccumulation of problems in the milk and meat of animals, higher levels of allergens, new diseases that would resist antibiotics, all sorts of things. And they urged their superiors to require long-term studies. Not only were they ignored, but their warnings were denied under the false pretense that the agency was not aware of any information of this sort. Now, Michael Taylor, after basically allowing GMOs onto the market without complete hands-off policy, later worked at the USDA on biotech issues, then became Monsanto's vice president, a reward for a job well done, and has now been assigned by the Obama administration as the U.S. food safety czar. So the person, I believe, who's responsible for more food-related illnesses and deaths than anyone in human history by fast-tracking GMOs, he may be responsible for that, is now in charge of the food supply safety in the U.S.
It's amazing. And, last hour I'll be talking with Dr. Betty Martini about aspartame.
Oh, yeah.
Same kind of thing, Jeffrey.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same kind of thing with Donald Rumsfeld's interference and all that. And aspartame, by the way, is a genetically engineered sweetener. They genetically engineer the microorganism to make it. So it's part of my look at. I look at that also. Now, one thing that I covered in my book, Seeds of Deception, over and over again, and it's on my website at responsibletechnology.org, and this is interesting, that of all the things that we talk about, all the research, the thousands of sick, sterile, and dead livestock, the toxic and allergic reactions, an epidemic which I haven't even talked about, that was discovered and related to a GM food supplement, of all the things that I present, there's a significant percentage of people that find the following information the most compelling. And that is, it started actually with a farmer, Howard Vliger, who decided to do a test with his cows. He put half of his trough with GM corn and the other half with non-GM corn.
He was doing this on his own.
On his own. He let the cows into the pen, and they all huddled around the non-GM corn. They wouldn't go near the GM corn. So he told this to some other fellas, and they started reproducing this with cows and pigs. Then he told it to a group of farmers, and someone said, well, I got a story. I put an ear of GM corn, nailed it to one tree, and non-GM corn to another tree, and the squirrels would only eat the non-GM corn, and this was in the winter in Iowa.
Amazing.
So after they ate the non-GM corn after a while, I would just replace it. I decided to do an experiment. I didn't replace the non-GM corn, and I just watched.
Let them starve. See what would happen, right?
For the coldest days in Iowa, and I'm from Iowa, and those 10 days were really cold. The coldest days in Iowa, the squirrels would not touch the GM corn. Finally, they nibbled like a few kernels, and the farmer, had pity on them and put out a non-GM, and they ate it immediately. Then someone else in Illinois decided, and I just spoke to them about this.
What a story.
They decided to do the squirrel thing, and the guy bought a bag of GM and non-GM ears and put it in a garage ready to do the study, and forgot about it. But when he went and discovered these and realized that the mice had done the study for them, they had broken into the bag of non-GM corn and eaten all the kernels and never touched the GM corn.
That's amazing.
And then there's another guy that saw geese who would just hang out on the side of a soybean field, munching away on the non-genetically modified soy, but not touching the genetically modified soy.
What is the mechanism in these animals that allow them to back off on the GM foods?
I don't know, and it's even like when they were trying to get the Flavor Saver tomato there, they did a rat feeding study. The CEO of Calgene said, you can be Chef Boyardee, but these rats are not going to eat these genetically modified tomatoes. There was a woman in South Africa. Her chickens would not eat genetically modified corn. There's the buffalo in India that wouldn't eat the cottonseed oil. There's when you let cows into the stubble of a GM cornfield, they'll just walk until they find the non-GM field and eat there if it's available. They have some, and the thing is, when they force-fed the rats these tomatoes, for example, 7 of 20 developed stomach lesions, another 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks.
Jeez.
When the buffalo in India did eat the cottonseed cakes, then most of them had reproductive problems, and many of them died. So they know something, and we don't know if it's smell, we don't know if it's some subtle sense in terms of the field effects, but we don't have that, which is why, of course, we create the non-GMOshoppingguide.com, so that people can get this, so we can raise humans up to the level of animals.
Now, let's go back, talk a little bit more about the FDA, what they're not doing to protect us, what we can do about labeling. And by the end of tonight with you on the show, Jeffrey, I want you to give us tips on what we can do at home or when we go shopping just to be smart.
And more than that, George, I'm going to describe for you a campaign that can end the genetic engineering of the food supply, and a whole campaign that we're launching. October is non-GMO month, 10-10-10 is non-GMO day. We have a momentum building up to that, and then we have a tipping point strategy between 10-10-10 and 11-11-11, and we're going to invite all of your listeners to participate. And so I would suggest that everyone go to responsibletechnology.org and sign up for the free newsletter, because we'll keep you informed of the activities going on all over the country and all over North America regarding non-GMO months. And also, before we get off, I'm going to talk to your listeners about an action they can take to protect our rights.
Well, you're not getting off for a while. You're going to be off.
I know. Right. I know. But the thing is, there's something going on in Ohio, and it's going to affect everyone if we don't move. But anyway, What was the question?
Well, let's talk about the FDA for a second.
All right, good.
I mean, why aren't they protecting us? And it's not just with the GM foods; it's with everything.